Now, here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Coming up, how does the federal government deal with Labour's landslide victory in Victoria? The Treasurer will have a whisker of a surplus earlier than expected. And what might he do with it? All the analysis with budget guru and economist Chris Richardson and Sky News Canberra reporter Alanis Nelson. Full steam ahead at Snowy Hydro, our exclusive interview with CEO Paul Broad on the two big customers he signed up today to deliver firmed-up renewable energy after this month's big investment in 8 renewable projects. We asked what this will do to the wholesale market for demand and prices and whether it helps the green light next month for Snowy 2.0. And a final huge week for the Royal Commission, kicking off with NAB Chief Andrew Thorburns' turn for a soup-to-nuts grilling, including the bank's introducer programme scandal. All the latest analysis on the discomfort with our chief reporter, Leo Shanahan, coming right up. Well, you know, what a watershed for Daniel Andrews and Victorian Labour, who sweep back into office on a massive red wave that's left the Liberals, state and federal, in collective shock.
We live our values, we keep our promises, and we get things done.
What are the messages here for the federal government, do we think? This is how Federal Treasurer and Victorian Josh Frydenberg responded to the result this morning.
What we don't have is proper wages movement in this country. Corporate profits are increasing by 10%, wages by 2%. Too many ordinary Australians are missing out on wage rises. They're dipping into the family savings. They're living on the family credit card just to pay the ordinary outgoing expenses of weekly life in this country.
Yeah, well, that was Labor leader Bill Shorten, of course. But the Treasurer blamed a big Labor scare campaign and on health and education. Yet the message from Labor to the federal government is really it's the economy, stupid, not the crime gangs. More than that, there's a disturbing undertone in this result, disturbing for the Morrison government. And it is that voters seem to be looking through scare campaigns, including Labor's scare campaign around Medicare that's been running, let's face it, forever. The electorate's bullshit radar is up, and short-term quick fixes based on focus groups seem to be getting far less traction than long-term vision, even if that vision is unpopular in certain quarters. Look, the marketing brilliance of the Prime Minister, backed by advisers like Crosby Textor, methodically knocked off all the barnacles, ditching big company tax cuts, throwing money at the drought for the Nats, the down electricity intervention, tossing out a rise in the pension age, sorting out Catholic school funding and announcing a Royal Commission of their own into aged care. But is it enough? In stark contrast, federal Labor is now offering big long-term policies that mean higher taxing and spending, changes to negative gearing, changes to dividend imputation, and something which looks remarkably like an NEG, a National Electricity Guarantee. The Wentworth by-election gave all the signs that Australians do want a trilemma solved, not just a dilemma, i.e. they want energy emissions and prices and reliability all sorted. What would be really disruptive would be not Dave Sharma to rerun in the seat of Wentworth, but for Malcolm Turnbull to come back and run. Well, stranger things have happened, even this year in politics, surely. Maybe not. But back to federal Labor. Chris Bowen, Shadow Treasurer, is more and more being viewed by business as the credible alternative. Some companies have already rearranged their capital management and dividend policies to preempt a change of government. Victorian Labor have also run a long-sighted campaign, albeit with a bit of a swifty in the late announcement to double state debt to fund infrastructure. But this is in the context of a state that's humming along quite nicely, thank you. There are some things like safe schools, which will now be baked in, much in Victoria, much to the distress of the exhausted majority parents. But perhaps the shift with the most concern for business under a federal Labor government would be the return of industry-wide bargaining to raise wages for Australian workers. Well, the National Australia Bank boss has conceded his organisation has made terrible mistakes while giving evidence in the final round of hearings in the Banking Royal Commission. Your Money Chief Business Reporter Leo Shanahan has been at the hearings in Melbourne and joins me now. Leo, did you do another chase?
There was a minor chase earlier, Ticky, that you missed out on, but yes. But actually, Ken Henry just left not too long ago. He didn't have much to say, although he had plenty to say in the witness stand this afternoon. More on that in a second. But yes, it's effectively the beginning of the end here at the Royal Commission, the beginning of the last week of public hearings. And It's been a long run. It's been almost exactly a year since the Royal Commission was announced. Today, Andrew Thorburn. Look, it started off reasonably well for Andrew Thorburn. There was probably a bit more discussion on general policy issues than he was maybe expecting. Michael Hodge, counsel assisting, it wasn't Rowena Orr. Michael Hodge led the charge this morning, and he has a different style. He builds up to something and I think tends to get people to hoist themselves on their own petard a bit. But the question early was about ethics. Is NAB an ethical bank? And have a listen to what Andrew Thorburn said that he understood by that.
The issue was we did not have sufficient controls in place to ensure that when the fee should have been turned off, it wasn't.
And yes, Leo, carry on. And so, and how did he go all the way through, do you think? How did he handle it, Andrew Thorburn?
Yeah, well, the questioning got a lot pointier towards the end when basically he was questioned on fee for no service. That is the obviously the scandal that is going to cost the NAB about $100 million, as well as this introducer program, which is open to fraud. It's been established. But listen to this interaction between Andrew Thorburn, the Commissioner, and counsel assisting as to what went wrong in that fees for no service scandal.
Do you think NAB has an ethically oriented culture?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Unfortunate cases where I'd have to say no.
And what do you understand by an ethically oriented culture?
Well, that you would always do what is right by the law, by regulations, by disclosure requirements to the likes of the stock exchange, by way of transparency, and by way of doing what the policies inside the company require you to do.
Andrew Thorburn there, and yes, as I said, it got pretty hairy towards the end when he was basically being asked about the fees for no service scandal and who was responsible. Of course, Andrew Haggai resigned really as a result of this, but counsel assisting really alluded to the fact that others must have known, and in fact the evidence trail points that others gave advice as to the remediation on this. And one of those people was Mr. Thorburn himself. He was really getting at this point, including other senior executives. But Ken Henry, the former Treasury Secretary, also took the stand this afternoon. His style was less combative, shall we say, a bit more lecturing towards the Royal Commission. And I think he has to watch that style. But have a listen to what he said about the expectations on boards at the moment in banks.
We have said consistently to APRA, the word ensure is a bit strong. It's really difficult for a board to be held accountable for ensuring anything, just as it's rather difficult to hold APRA to that standard of ensuring an appropriate risk culture.
Yeah, really interesting seeing Ken Henry there. Briefly, Leo, any questions about thermomixers or EAs? Anything to do with Andrew Thorburn's personal court case?
No, there was no questions relating to, of course, his former chief of staff, who is under police investigation in the midst of a fraud investigation.
Yes, now, sorry, an investigation.
We had thought that maybe some questions would be asked by them, but it didn't actually eventuate. It is interesting. I understand that investigations are quite a precarious point, so perhaps there was some police intervention there, not really wanting that issue to be explored anymore by the Royal Commission.
Yeah, I'm sure Andrew Thorburn's grateful for small mercies as well. Leo Shanahan, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, it's been dubbed the baby brother of the ASX, and it's making a new pitch to Aussie companies to get listed. A pitch at not only the smaller end of town at the moment, the fintechs, but also increasingly agribusinesses and resource companies, where the NSX offers a simpler, cheaper process. The average capital raising, I think, is just over 8 mil. So will that increase in size in the rather more volatile times? And how does the NSX keep up with its own technology funding needs as the push is on to do things like make settlement real time? Well, joining me at the desk is NSX boss Anne Bowering, and great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So how has the NSX been going?
Oh, we've had a really exciting 24 months. We've undergone a substantial restructure of our business, which has been...
Because you've been driving that, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate to come on board in June 2016 and went through a major change in terms of restructuring our Newcastle and Sydney office, closed Melbourne office and bringing them to Sydney. That was a really key part of our transformation.
So in terms of the sort of front on for your customers, what changed?
Engagement with our investors. So one of the key changes we needed to make was to enhance our distribution. So at the heart of an exchange is liquidity and access to liquidity, and we were really fortunate to partner with a company called Iris, which has enabled us to now sit NSX stocks alongside ASX stocks as they go out to market with the investors.
So why would, say, a tech startup who's looking to go to the boards to get some capital, why would they go to NSX as opposed to ASX?
Sure. Well, for starters, our market's really geared towards growth stage companies. So our listing rules are tailored to meet the needs. So one example would be our spread requirements. To list on NSX, you require a spread of 50 shareholders as opposed to, say, 300 on ASX, which makes it a lot more achievable for companies in that growth cycle.
What about that prospectus that you have to write?
Yeah, look, do you know what? That's a really important document because that's the basis that the investors make decisions on. But and so those requirements are consistent across the marketplace.
Are they?
But where we do we add value, I think, is in our customer service and the way that we work with issuers on their process to IPO. It's a really important step for companies. Sometimes they do it once in a lifetime. Sometimes you might get an opportunity to do it twice. But at the end of the day, you want to know early what the pathway is to IPO, identify any issues, and be part of the solution as the exchange to get those companies on board.
So how many stocks have you actually got on the board now?
Around 80 securities. We've got debt and equity securities listed on NSX.
And what about IPOs possibly in the pipeline? Because we just saw PEXA being, sort of wobbling, the other day. Is the market putting people off?
Look, I think we have some great companies in our pipeline and we haven't seen any waivers yet. But what's important to note is that there are more than one reason to IPO. And so I guess the marketplace in Australia has been conditioned to an ASX IPO, i.e. as an exit model or raising large sums of money at an IPO. An IPO gives companies access to liquidity, it helps them to bring on new management, embark on new strategies, get a transparent evaluation, build a track record. So there are a lot of reasons why a company might want to IPO that are not necessarily dependent on the ability to raise capital. So we've got some really interesting companies in the pipeline. And
for those who are not really familiar with exchanges, why isn't Chi-X a comparison, for example? Because we hear a lot about Chi-X.
Yeah, and they're a fantastic trading platform. So what they are is a venue that quotes securities listed on other markets.
But they're not a stock exchange in Australia?
So they're not a listing and trading venue in Australia. They provide a mechanism for trading, whereas there are two places you can list in Australia, on NSX or ASX.
Yeah, very interesting. I didn't quite get my head around that until now. So big challenges for the ASX. We've seen this blockchain investment, the sort of milestones get kicked down the road a little bit. What are you doing, given presumably you have far less funding than the ASX?
Yeah, so interestingly, we are both a customer and a competitor to ASX, which presents challenges, obviously.
So that's just like the little brother, really?
Yes, correct, exactly. So we need access to their infrastructure. Currently, they are a monopoly in settlement and clearing in Australia, so we work with them to access that service.
So if blockchain goes ahead, or whatever it is, the system, the real-time settlement system, you will be adopting that too, presumably?
Yeah, one of the requirements is they provide equal access to all market operators as they launch that system.
What do you think of it? I mean, is it got big challenges before it really gets up?
I think, look, it's a huge project. CHESS has CHESS was a global leader in its time and has provided a fantastic solution to the Australian marketplace.
Yes.
Replacing CHESS is naturally going to be a big challenge, but we are seeing opportunities for competition in that space as well. We obviously have Chi-X providing competition in trading. We have NSX providing competition in listing and trading.
But you're bound to the ASX, are you?
We are, but you know, there is now an opportunity for competition to emerge in clearing and settlement as well.
I was interviewing the other day the head of the Swiss Stock Exchange, and he's got a model where he's doing it. Of course, he's got all the money to do it with, but he's starting with a completely sort of vanilla exercise where if it goes well, he can then throw everything onto it rather than it being a big change from within.
Yes, and that's certainly a different approach. But you know, I think that this period of change in the marketplace creates a lot of opportunities. So it's a time where the whole market can reflect on, okay, here's the model we have, but how do we want the model to be in the future, and what's the best form for Australia to progress and, you know, be globally competitive in terms of financial marketplaces.
And who owns you?
We're a listed company, and so we have a diverse range of shareholders.
Right. Right, okay. And I did mention that it wasn't just startups, it was agri, it was resources. Is that your focus in terms of the clients that you're looking for?
Yes, so we've got a great track record in terms of resource companies. We've had some great successes in terms of rice growers, Sunrice, sugar terminals. Capilano was an NSX listing, but you know, currently we have a company called RFM Poultry.
That may go, of course, Capilano.
Yes, correct. Yeah. RFM Poultry is a great listing that we have. So, and one of the reasons we've had success in that space is because we've offered what's in essentially an NSX private market model for co-ops. So it enables us to really tailor our products to meet the needs of agri companies. Absolutely, growth and opportunities with co-ops, absolutely. But equally in the mutual space where you're looking at member-based organisations who are looking for models for liquidity and transparency, credit unions and banks and so on. We certainly see an opportunity to target those companies as well.
Very interesting. Anne Bowering, thank you so much for telling us a little bit about NSX.
Thank you very much, Ticky.
OK, well, after the break, a gift for the government with a report on a jump in revenues. So what will that mean for MyEFO or an earlier budget? Report author Chris Richardson from Deloitte Access Economics coming up.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, the Morrison-led government looks set to be flush with cash heading into the federal elections, according to a fresh report from Deloitte Access Economics partner Chris Richardson. The budget could be just into surplus. I spoke with Chris Richardson a little earlier on.
Yeah, look, the news is very good on our forecasts. The government budget this year will be $10 billion better than the government was estimating in the budget in May. Now, that would still leave it just a whisker on the wrong side of surplus, about $5 billion. They could, if the political will were there, rate a few hollow logs, Reserve Bank dividends and the like, and call it a surplus. But as the weekend's election reminds us, chances are the politics will mean they're more likely to be spending in marginal electorates than worried in the short term about getting an earlier surplus.
Right, so MyEFO itself, which is coming up soon, what, mid-December sometime, that's where we could see some engineering if there was to be any?
Yeah, look, if the government does choose to do that final surge for surplus, we should know as soon as MyEFO, and as you say, that would be only a handful of weeks away. And basically, you know, no matter what they say in MyEFO, there is a good news story. And it's been a decade of deficits. It's finally drawing to a close. There is still that outside chance that they get to surplus this year. But either way, on current trajectory, it does look like a surplus next year.
Driven by this increase in revenues from company taxes in particular, but also a bracket creep.
Yeah, and there's elements of that there too. The biggest single dollar change is in company taxes. It's a profit story, and that's always what makes or breaks short-term swings in the budget. People tend to think budgets get made in Canberra. They actually get made in the economy. and you're seeing a substantial surge in profits, which is showing up as an even bigger surge in profit taxes. So nominal GDP, the number of dollars, if you like, of annual income in the Australian economy, growing about 5% this year, but in the last 12 months alone, we've seen 10% growth in revenues, and that's the way it works. When the economy is good, the budget is even better. Yes, you're also seeing it with a little bit of bracket creep. The key positive there, though, isn't really wages, it's jobs.
Right. So, interestingly, obviously more people in work paying more tax. Given the slow wages growth, though, and given what Labor has said recently in terms of how they'll try and address this issue, and given the calls for industry-wide bargaining, presumably we could see some pressure on wages.
In fact, although the average Australian, I'm sure, would shake their head, wage growth in Australia has been lifting for 2 years now. Its low point was in late 2016. We got new data only a week ago showing that wage growth continues ever so slowly to accelerate, up comfortably over 2% in the last year and running a little bit ahead of inflation. Having said that, it's been slowly. What you're getting is a slow switch out of job growth and into wage growth as the main way that economic growth is showing up.
Given, though, that the perception out there is that wages are going up all too slowly, do you think there'll be a lot of pressure on the government returning some of this largesse that we can see from the revenues in income tax cuts?
Look, absolutely. I think priority number one, as usual, or certainly as usual when there's some extra money, is to put that money into marginal electorates. Priority 2 will be tax cuts. Priority 3 will be the surplus. And the thing about the tax cuts will be how big and how soon those promises are. Given the government's standing in the polls, given, for example, that Victorian election over the weekend,
exactly,
they may be tempted to promise a lot, though perhaps a little bit of it on the never, and in effect dare Labor to say no to the tax cuts that the coalition government is promising in the run-up to this election.
Yeah, but given that there are now clearly seats under threat in Victoria and Queensland they need to shore up, presumably the temptation for the Treasurer would be, or the urgency from his point of view, would be quite large.
Absolutely, and if you think back, across history in Australia, 2 recent examples. 2007, the coalition government, on its way to an election loss, promised too much by way of tax cuts. 2013, a Labor government on its way to an election loss promised too much by way of spending increases. Governments that are throwing the Hail Mary pass, if you like, if they really think they're up against it in the electoral competition, will tend to stretch. And that's a risk. At the moment it's the coalition in those circumstances. They may stretch by promising rather large personal income tax cuts, and as I say, daring Labor not to do it. That is a risk. It's marvellous that the economy is looking better. It's marvellous that that's showing up, particularly in the budget, but we should not take that love to town. It is the absolute oldest mistake in the budget in Australia, right, to take temporary good news in the economy and make permanent policy promises.
Right, particularly as you say, things like the possible China slowdown continues, etc., etc. But now the politics of it, back to the politics of it again, what are the chances of an early budget now, and what are the politics around an early budget?
Look, the whispers are certainly that an early budget is on the cards. Given the timing of when the election has to be held by, that would suggest maybe early April. And if that happens, it's a couple of things. It's a chance for the government to showcase its policies ahead of the election, lock them in, have them officially costed by Treasury and Finance, all those sorts of things. But there's a second round of locking in. Once every electoral cycle, the officials in Treasury and Finance get their chance to say what they think about where the economy and where the budget is headed in the pre-election fiscal outlook, PFO. But if there is a budget released just ahead of the election being called, you can be pretty sure that PFO out of Treasury will be copy and paste, and that you won't have leading public servants, if you like, having much of a chance to tell Australians and Australian voters what they think, you know, the independent view of where the economy and the budget are headed.
Briefly, what chances do you think there are of New Start getting a substantial lift? Because I know you care about that a lot.
Look, I'd love to see it. It's the standout fairness fail in the Australian budget. Long overdue, but I can't say I expect it.
Chris Richardson, great to get your report and some good news on a Monday for the government. Thanks very much. After the break, we drill down into the landslide victory for Victorian State Labor over the weekend and what that means for the federal campaign, with ministers bunkered down in crisis talks today.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Welcome back. Well, the Victorian Premier has announced the start of the largest road project in the state's history. Daniel Andrews says he's getting on with the job after Labor's stunning election victory over the weekend.
2 days after his thumping election victory, it was all smiles as the Premier and his team delivered Labor's first election commitment.
We've done a little better than that. We've got it out there on day one.
The North East Link will cost $16.5 billion and take up a huge chunk of the borrowings from Victoria's new debt bill that was announced on Thursday to pay for the big projects. It'll include a 5-kilometre long tunnel linking Springvale Road to the Hume.
We are one of the only cities in the world that's got a ring road with a great gap in it. It doesn't make sense.
Labor announcing a $200 million early works package to get the project started.
The Premier says he doesn't waste a minute. Well, here we are, the first day back at work, an hour and a half into it. 100 days, I think, was the plan, and on day one.
Builders are now being sought to construct the tunnel, a process expected to take 18 months. The whole project will create more than 10,000 jobs. As the Premier came to Greensborough to announce that Labor was getting on with the job, building big, expensive infrastructure projects, it's a different story for the Victorian Liberals as the recriminations begin to find out what went wrong. Victorian Liberal President Michael Kroger says the Libs were outflanked in spending by Labor.
The public thirst for unparalleled public expenditure is at levels we've never seen before. See how popular the NDIS is, Gonski is, all of this massive spending. Now, of course, the Liberal Party, quite frankly, cannot compete with that.
Michael Kroger has himself come under fire for his ongoing battle against a major Liberal Party donor. Jeff Kennett wants him to resign.
Nick Greiner didn't move on after the federal president, didn't move on after the Wentworth by-election, did he? I mean, was it Nick Greiner's fault that we lost Wentworth? I mean, no, I think a few of us are a bit more sophisticated than that.
But Kroger has defended his role and influence in the election result. Following the election, the Premier says he received a text from the Prime Minister congratulating him on the win. Daniel Andrews also paying tribute to his opponent, Matthew Guy.
He didn't get the result he wanted, but I wish him all the best.
Aaron Young, Sky News, Melbourne.
Well, the big question, of course, is how all this, the news of the Victorian election, is set to impact the federal government and the looming election. Well, Sky News political reporter Annalise Nielsen joins us from our Canberra studio. Annalise, what has been the response? They've all been bunkered down, have they, ministers? Lots of meetings?
They have. There was a meeting this morning, which we've been calling a crisis meeting. Others within the Liberal ranks have been wanting to be a bit more cautious about that terminology, but it's certainly called awfully quickly after this election result, because those Victorian MPs are very concerned that there is a revolt among the Victorian electorates and it will affect them at the next federal election. And so there's a lot of discussion about how much cut through the federal politics would have had for voters when they were going to vote on Saturday, or whether it was more state-based issues. And what's really interesting is we've seen Premier Daniel Andrews say that he thought it was more state-based, and federal Labor as well saying that they think it's because there was a strong case to be made for the Labor government in Victoria. And that's quite clearly because they do want a strong mandate in that state to go ahead with their projects. As you were saying before, they've had many, but it is obviously a cause for concern among the Liberal Party. But senior Liberal leaders seem to be really calling for calm and caution. It was one of the Liberal frontbenchers, Dan Tian, this morning, who was saying that he thinks that the Liberal Party needs to step back and assess based on the facts.
It's time for cool heads, calm analysis, and get the facts, and then we've got 6 months to address it. And I would say to all my colleagues, time to be calm,
time to look at what went on, look at it methodically, and then let's do the analysis, roll the sleeves up.
Now, with those out and about talking in Parliament today, the two big issues that seem to be coming to the surface about this election result in Victoria has either been the instability in the Liberal leadership federally, about discontent with that, but also about a lack of a coherent energy policy. And that seems to have played quite strongly in Victoria, where there is quite a progressive population, where people are quite happy to embrace things like renewable energy. And we heard at least one Liberal MP, this is Tim Wilson, this morning with some very strong words for his colleagues.
It's about dealing with coastal erosion. It's about getting rid of waste and rubbish. It's about making sure that we do confront greenhouse gas emissions. But if anybody thinks that there's this great public sentiment out there that people really deep down hate renewables and they're deep really hugging something like coal, I say again, get real.
Annalise, do you think this is actually going to shift the dial at all in terms of federal Liberal government policy?
I think it would certainly have implications for how they're going to run their campaign, because they'll certainly be taking notes about how the Liberal Party ran their campaign in Victoria. It wasn't very policy focused. It was quite negative in their campaigning. They were spending a lot of time attacking the government. They were really hard on this law and order issue, which doesn't seem to have played as strongly among Victorians as they were probably hoping. But for the Federal Liberal Party, they certainly know what they need to be making their case over for the next election, and they, I think, will be taking notes from Daniel Andrews as well about what he did so strongly. But they're on the back foot now. We've seen in federal parliament today, we've had Dr. Karen Phelps sworn in as the member for Wentworth, replacing Malcolm Turnbull. So the government's lost their majority in the lower house, and so for them to be able to push through any...
And there's this integrity bill that Cathy McGowan, the Independents, put through as well, or put in place, hasn't it?
Yeah, so there were two different aspects to this today, which has really confused things. So it was Cathy McGowan introduced a private members bill, and it was also, there was a motion in the Senate. That was an old motion. It was from weeks ago, from previous sitting weeks, that the government could have voted against. But if they'd done it, then that would have prompted debate in the upper house, and so they would have been in the uncomfortable position of having senators sitting around just saying that they didn't agree with a anti-corruption body. But Cathy McGowan did go ahead and put this bill for a anti-corruption body to the lower house, and so that hasn't been voted on yet. But the government has been saying that they do have serious issues with this legislation. They're worried that it will be a bit of a Pandora's box, that it could implicate a lot of politically charged roles within the public service, and it could even implicate journalists, is what we're hearing, that they're saying journalists who work for the ABC and SBS could be called before this commission, asked to reveal sources, and caught on anti-corruption things that there certainly wasn't intended in this bill. And so that's why the government has said it's not supporting it, but they did have to vote in support of this motion in the Senate, because if they didn't, then we could have gone to the lower house, and it would have, for the first time, tested the fact that they don't have the majority there.
Right, Annalise Nielsen, that's fascinating stuff. Thank you very much for joining us there.
Thanks.
Well, after the break, our exclusive interview with Snowy's Paul Broad coming up.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, let's talk Europe first. All 27 European leaders have signed off on a Brexit deal proposed by British Prime Minister Theresa May. The EU President, Donald Tusk, made the announcement saying they had endorsed the withdrawal agreement and political declaration on the future EU-UK relations.
Ahead of us is the difficult process of ratification as well as further negotiations. But regardless of how it will all end, one thing is certain. We will remain friends until the end of days.
Well, the agreement came after the UK managed to make an agreement with Spain over a disputed territory. The Spanish Prime Minister has been offered a say over the future of the disputed British territory after threatening to boycott the crucial Brexit summit in Brussels. Theresa May says she will do all she can to get support from British MPs now.
When they look at this deal, they will see it as a good one for our country and that it is in the national interest for everyone to get behind it. It honours the referendum, protects what we value and sets us on course for a bright future. Today marks the culmination of our exit negotiations with the EU, but it also marks the start of a crucial national debate in our country over the next few weeks. Before Christmas, MPs will vote on this deal. It will be one of the most significant votes that Parliament has held for many years.
Well, although the 27 leaders have given their blessing, as you've heard from the British PM, it now faces the hurdle of approval by the British Parliament. Joining me to talk about what's next in the British journey, I'm joined by the Australian-British Chamber of Commerce Chief, David McCredie. David, we've been following this, we've been talking it all through last week. This was a great victory for Theresa May, but an expected one.
Yeah, I think so. I think we talked about last week that the negotiations have been going on for some time. Both sides were pretty clear before now. Indeed, that's what Theresa May took to the Cabinet, was what had been agreed in principle by both sides.
Yeah, so this bickering over fishing rights that France and, was it Holland?
Yep.
Had, that seemed to go away with a whimper?
Yeah, well, I think that's what we've seen in the past, and we've talked about the way Europe tends to work. Is it's when the leaders get round the table at the crucial time, at the end of the period. That's when it really comes together.
What is this small thing, this concession that Britain appears to have been given the Spaniards over having some say in the future of Gibraltar?
Look,
how's that going to go down?
Well, talking about fishing rights perhaps is a bit of a red herring, I think. I suspect, look, where the game's up to now is we've got the withdrawal agreement.
Yes.
Now it's about the future arrangements.
Yes.
And obviously Spain are seeing an opportunity to flex their muscle, and the French and the Dutch we talked about last week with fishing rights.
Yeah.
These are all yet to play for, because it's...
Oh, so even the fishing rights thing is part of the next sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. So the next part of... Assuming that this deal, which has not finished being ratified yet, as...
No, it's a big if, the British Parliament, yeah.
The British Parliament's a massive if.
Mm-hmm.
There's still some question marks around the European Parliament potentially as well, although much more unlikely to get in the way. And it depends on what process, and I have to be clear here, I'm not 100% clear on what process internally within the EU 27 countries they will have to go through in terms of what their MEPs will vote for, etc.
Yeah.
However, assuming that this goes through,
yes.
That only takes us up to the end of 2020.
Yes. Where there'll be some slightly different MEPs, because they've got a May election, don't they?
They do, and there won't be any British MEPs, assuming that this deal goes through, because the UK will have left the European Union.
Yes, still subject though to European rule on tariffs and that sort of thing, yet not part of any opportunity to change the rules as other European countries are, which is probably one of the biggest issues that Brexiteers would have with the arrangement.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think the way the Prime Minister is framing that is very clearly we needed a transition period. Because the EU have been very steadfast that the withdrawal had to be finalised before the future arrangements could be discussed.
Yes.
It's meant that the future arrangements aren't bedded down yet. The negotiation for what the future looks like is yet to be played out. So those issues will come up in those discussions. Absolutely, of course they will.
Yes. So we read that on both sides, the Remainer side and the Brexiteer side, no one's particularly happy with Theresa May's deal. And that's largely because of the backstop, do we think? That people don't trust the backstop?
Well, I think the challenge is that at the moment, the European Union have the upper hand.
Yes.
Because they have the backstop. We all know that nobody wants the Northern Irish border issue to be an issue in the medium term or the longer term even. So we need to come to an arrangement which allows that to go away. And the problem that we've faced in the discussion about the backstop in the first place is, well, we don't know what that will look like in such a way that we don't have to have a hard border.
No, they have to trust. Yeah,
but we just need to go through that process. We need to find out whether technology can be an answer. There are lots of propositions that are out there, but because we haven't negotiated the forward future agreement yet,
it's all to come.
It is all still to play for.
David McCredie, great. Thanks for bringing us up to date, and we'll talk a little later in the week, I hope. Thanks very much. Right, well now there's been a lot happening at Snowy Hydro this month, which CEO Paul Broad believes could well change the game on energy supply and pricing. At the start of November, Snowy announced it was looking for more renewable energy and signed up 8 solar and wind contracts that will provide a total 888 megawatts from different producers. This energy will be firmed up, just like the Energy Minister Angus Taylor would like it to be, with Snowy Hydro's dam capacity, you'd think, for HEP. Well, today, Paul Broad has announced 2 major business customers that have signed up to take Snowy renewable energy from Snowy and Snowy-owned Red Energy in a move that he says will change the dynamics in the wholesale market. Well, CEO Paul Broad joins me live from Canberra, where he's been doing lots of deals. Paul, nice to talk. Just explain to me how significant both the beginning of the month, these 8 new investments, and these contracts are.
Yeah, g'day Twiggy. Look, they're terrific for us. We've always been short energy, so when we go out for these big industrial and commercial customers, we had to rely on the big 3 dominant generators to provide us with the energy, and we've never been able to get price competitive. Now, for the first time, having gone to the market, been able to attract enormous amount of renewables to get 888 megawatts, which we can then firm up. So it's firm, it's 36% capacity firmed up, which converts to 2.8 terawatt hours a year. Or people want to think about that. Mums and dads land, that's 500,000 customers. So we will now have energy where we can be really competitive with the big players in the marketplace, and the ones who will gain from that will be the big consumers and the small consumers.
So Angus Taylor has been talking about underwriting some of these firmed up energy transactions. I mean, your relationship obviously with the government is slightly different, so presumably will you have any support from government on the other end of these deals or not?
Zero, and there was some discussion in the press recently that somehow we're crowding out the private sector. All these renewables are all new. They're all funded by the private sector. They're going to spend somewhere in the order of $1 billion, and the investors come from all around the world. So by having Snowy available to be able to firm up those renewables, we are attracting in huge amounts of private sector investment, and we can deliver that competitively in a marketplace that's been dominated by 3 dominant players in the energy space. So bringing in a 4th player, creating more competition, allows you to put pressure on prices. And that's the big news. I mean, we can firm this up. The energy costs will be sub $70. And the current price are in the 90s. So we're getting significant downward pressure by 2020 on wholesale prices, which will then flow through to customers, mums and dads customers, and the corporate sector, which allows us, again, as a robust economy, to be competitive in energy. So
can you tell us anything about your 2 big contracts today, what sort of customers they are and what they're looking for, why they're looking for alternative energy?
Well, a lot of big businesses today are voting with their dollar. They're saying they've recognised that the tipping point on renewables now been passed, that at the margin new energy sources will dominantly come from renewables. So they want to get into the act. And Dexus, which is a large supplier of office space effectively, they want to have a renewable energy contract with someone who can guarantee 4 renewables. So within the suite of the energy deals we've done on the 888 megawatts, we'll allocate a portion of that to Dexus. We'll firm that energy up with Snowy, and for the first time we're doing so over a 7-year period. So that's a wonderful contract for us. So we're very excited the Dexus deal. And the other one is the University of Newcastle, a great place, my old university actually, a place that I enjoy enormously. They also wanted to have a renewable deal, and we could offer up for them for the first time a very competitive energy deal which can deliver up renewables at a very competitive price. And for us, we usually come 9th out of 10th on most of these industrial deals, and now to be competitive is a big step forward for us.
So what about Snowy 2.0? Because obviously that was enthusiastically pushed by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Since Scott Morrison's taken over, people have been questioning whether there might be a rethink on all of this. The big decision on the green light, I think, is next month. Does what you've done now make a difference, do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we've done now is show that as the market evolves with Snowy 2.0, with 2,000 megawatts, we can firm up enormous amount of renewables. So we can fill in the gaps between when the wind isn't blowing, the sun's not shining. So with existing Snowy and 2.0, we'll be able to deliver up these products. And the other good thing about this deal, what it showed to us is how cheap energy is from renewables. We're getting energy in the mid $40 range, straight energy on renewables. That puts a cap on our pumping costs. So now the spread between what we have to pump and what we'll sell at, we've now firmed it up. So it makes the economics even stronger for 2.0.
Right.
So yeah, 2.0 is on track.
Because obviously the capital investment is going to be large for 2.0. It's a taxpayer funded thing, obviously. And so what you're saying is that the business case has become, more positive with these sorts of deals being done.
Yeah, Ticky, it's not taxpayer funded. The funding for this comes from our customers.
Yes, okay.
No,
So
most people
apologies, yeah. But you are
sensitive, you know. I'm getting old and sensitive, you know.
But you are, yes, no, we should make that absolutely clear. But you are owned, aren't you, by by government?
We are.
Absolutely.
We are owned, and the government expects us to perform like anyone else, and they expect the business case to stack up. So testing the market as we did allows us to become even more confident about the economics. And we put out an MJA report which went through the economics when we this time last year. We'll put out an updated MJA report when we come out in December. So the economics is getting stronger, which supports the large capital investment we'll make.
And more broadly, how do you see the Labour's policy now for a national energy guarantee pulling in the emissions side, which is quite unlike what the government is doing?
Yeah, look, I think there's been a lot of policy debate, and that policy debate will continue going on. What I'm seeing in the market, without all the interventions, in the market, we are past the tipping point, so that the economics for firming up renewables as it comes in at the margin, it's not, the coal will keep going on for another 30 or 40 years, but at the margin, where new sources of energy are coming from, they are now very competitive. That's happening in the marketplace, and what we like to do is understand the policy frameworks that get established, but a big drive for us for how we see the market for the next 30 years.
Yeah, and so were the Labour Party to come in, and were their sort of policies to come through with the sort of targets that they're looking at, with the off-grid subsidies that they're talking about, in addition to Victoria now, can you see this transition being smooth?
Oh, I don't think anything energy can be particularly smooth, but I can say to you that now, it's basically getting bipartisan support. I mean, there is a mindset change, and understanding that transition's got to be done in a very orderly way. The complexity of our energy sector is enormous. So I don't see these things happening in a rush. I think these things will happen in an orderly way. If the market can respond in a progressive way, that the flexing of our coal-fired plants, the introduction of renewables firmed up by Snowy and others, by by the Shellhaven scheme, or wherever that renewables or wherever that storage comes from, firmed up, allowing it to compete with the existing players. That should be an orderly transfer, and provided we don't get too many more shocks on the policy front, I think most of the changes that are being foreseen have been factored in.
Yeah, there was some concern about this huge rise in renewables, firmed up or otherwise, potentially actually hollowing out the business model of the existing coal-fired power stations and actually making their longevity even shorter, which could lead to a more lumpy transition. What's the timing on your projects getting up and running?
So we'll have these 800 megawatts available by 2020. And we see 2.0 hitting in the market about 2025. So it's an orderly transfer as far as we can see. But there's no doubt with the marginal cost of renewables being so low, that makes it hard for the big base loaders to flex. And what you're seeing in the marketplace is a lot of the big base loaders are buying into renewables themselves. So they can control in as many ways their base load and the renewables. So a lot of the players are responding. And by introducing a fourth competitor like us in this marketplace will certainly change the dynamics of that market.
Paul Broad, it's great to hear this first on Ticky. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Well, that's all for the show tonight. You can see the show again at 10 p.m. tonight on Foxtel's Channel 601 and free-to-air Channel 95. Tomorrow night, Pottinger's Nigel Lakeover from New York and Sarah Hales from Wellcamp Airport. Thanks for your company.